to me, come to me.
Our chalice lighting words are by Julianne Lepp. It's called Open to Unexpected Answers. We seek peace in our place in the world and the answers to our heart's deep questions. And as we seek, may our hearts be open to unexpected answers. May the light of our chalice remind us that this is a community of warmth, of wisdom, and welcoming of multiple truths. Good morning on this beautiful Sunday as we move into the warm days of summer. I'm Martha Sinkula, your service leader for today, and I welcome you to the Umpqua Unitarian Universalist congregation. I know it continues to be important that we stay connected during this difficult time, and I hope all of you are well, taking care to be safe. Those on our congregational mailing list receive weekly newsletters regarding our Sunday services and general information about our congregation. We are now beginning live discussions using Zoom. Look for emails for connections. Facebook and YouTube carry our weekly sermons. Contact information can be found on our Facebook page. We hope those who are new to us will check us out. Our speaker today is Michael Wheeler, our Director of Music here at UUUC. He's an accomplished musician and an in-depth thinker. Michael shares his vast knowledge of music, history, and philosophy in his frequent thought-provoking sermons. He is also our director, videographer, and editor of all our recorded sermons that you're seeing every week. Doing excellent work. Thank you, Michael. Our opening words today are by Henry Miller. Life has no other discipline to impose if we would but realize it. than to accept life unquestioningly. Everything we shut our eyes to, everything we run away from, everything we deny, denigrate, or despise serves to defeat us in the end. What seems nasty, painful, evil can become a source of beauty, joy, and strength if faced with an open mind. Every moment is a golden one for those who have the vision to recognize it as such. Our meditation today is by Boethius. I'd like everyone to find a comfortable place in your chair, wherever you are. And if you would like to put your hands upward or folded in your lap, whichever is comfortable for you. Take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. Listen to the words. Enjoy the silence and the music. This is Song 3, Truth's Paradoxes. Why does a strange discordance break the ordered scheme's fair harmony? Hath God decreed twixt truth and truth there may be such lasting warfare be? That truths each severally plain will we strive to reconcile in vain? Or is the discord not in truth, since truth is self-consistent ever? But close in freshly wrappings held, the blinded mind of man can never discern, so faint her taper shines, the subtle change that all combines. Ah, then why burns man's restless mind, truth's hidden portals to unclose? Knows he really already what he seeks? Why toil to seek it if he knows? Yet, happily, if he knoweth not, why blindly seek he knows not what? Who for a good he knows not sighs? Who can an unknown end pursue? How find, how e'en when haply found, hail that strange form he never knew? Or is it that man's inmost soul once knew each part and knew the whole? Now, though by fleshly vapors dimmed, not all forgot her visions past. For while the several parts are lost, to the one whole she cleaveth fast. Whence he, who yearns the truth to find, is neither sound of sight nor blind, for neither does he know in full, nor is he reft of knowledge quite, but, holding still to what is left, he gropes in the uncertain light, and by the part that still survives, to win back all he bravely strives.
Good morning, all. So, once again, it gets to be my Sunday, and I was kind of inspired by Leslie's service last time. So instead, I'm broadcasting to you from my home music studio. And before I start the service, I want to ask you an obvious, maybe the most obvious question you'll hear for a while. But the reason I'm broadcasting from home is I have props. And so I have a screwdriver and a hammer. And the question before you, when we begin, is between the screwdriver and the hammer, what is the superior tool? Right. Now, like I said, it was an easy question because I imagine every single one of you answered, well, it depends on what you're doing with it. It depends on what the job is. And the premise that I would like to set before you is that as well as we have physical toolboxes to accomplish physical tasks, be it in home repair or in things like woodworking or machine repair, a more complete toolbox is going to serve you better. And at this stage of my life, the belief that I've come to is that when it comes to politics or how to construct and maintain a healthy society, that we need a healthy dose of every viewpoint, that every viewpoint gives us a tool in order to accomplish the societal tasks ahead of us. Now, what we've seen, especially over the last 3 or so years, but going back farther than that, is a massive polarization of American society, actually the world society, but we live in America, so American society. And another belief that I've come to is that arguments, while they can be entertaining, debating can be entertaining, it is not as valuable as discussion. In a debate, one side is trying to win. One side is trying to dominate the other side with ideals. Whereas in a true discussion, both parties ought to be seeking the truth. And that's where the idea of a SteelMan comes into play. It's a very valuable way to make sure that you are not talking past each other when talking to somebody with a different viewpoint or even a different premise. So what is a SteelMan? A SteelMan is the opposite of a straw man. A straw man is a misrepresentation of someone's point of view in order to make that point of view less coherent or less valuable, less valid. A steelman, however, is attempting to see another point of view from the perspective of the person that has that view, then to articulate that view in a way that the person would agree with. And it's incredibly important when trying to come to some sort of consensus in finding what is actually the correct path. So one more realization that I've had is how deeply both sides of our political divide need each other. Conservatives need strong, sober-minded liberals, and liberals absolutely need strong, sober-minded conservative viewpoints. Without that balance, what we find are civilizations that will just march each other directly off a cliff. So one of the figures that I've become more interested in as time has gone by is the Japanese nationalist and philosopher and author Yukio Mishima, who wrote a seminal piece of philosophy for his life titled Sun and Steel. And in it, he proposes that we become what we imbibe. We become more like the things with which we interact. So, for instance, he was an amateur bodybuilder, and he talked about the process of running in the sun, running in the sunlight, and how the sun affects your body in terms of, for instance, skin tone. Some people get a nice tan, other people, like me, just wind up sunburnt. But that the heat of the sun has a refining quality to your sense of endurance. So it is with steel that he, as an amateur bodybuilder, he would lift weights, and he noticed that the hardness of steel, the weight of steel, was something that the muscles started to resemble with their hard edges and their density and weight. And one quote that's interesting to me, which I hope I can expound on as we go on, is I am one who has always been interested only in the edge of the body and the spirit. The outlying regions of the body and the outlying regions of the spirit. The depths hold no interest for me. I leave them to others, for they are shallow, commonplace. What is there, then, at the outermost edge? Nothing, perhaps save a few ribbons dangling down into the void. Okay, so we'll piece that apart a little bit. Um, I want you to keep that in mind, because I believe that the views we hold, the values we hold, represent a dense outer shell. It is the cutting blade against which we move into society with our views and our values. I always thought that in my teaching career, perhaps this is a little bombastic or egotistical, uh, but it really is how I tried to conduct my teaching life, is that this was a holy war, that this was a war against ignorance, that this was a war against those who would force their views upon you, and that if you can train minds, if you can train your own mind to be sharp and to be able to draw comparisons, weigh what is in front of you versus what it is you've held to believe in your past, what people are challenging you with versus the ways in which you were brought up. And this is a very difficult process in life, because we're not built for drastic change. We can make small changes very easily, but the way that our brilliant pattern-seeking brains are wired is that our views become something of habits. And habits are things that the brain can do automatically, which is why perhaps addiction is such a bad problem. It's because the brain adapts to certain stimuli, and then those become familiar. And whether or not it's healthy, what is familiar tends to be what's comfortable. And this is something that is very common when it comes to our belief system as well, our principles as well. Even though there may be more to our principles than even we have considered. I have one more prop. And I want to show you, because I was talking about Yukio Mishima and his interest in bodybuilding and in traditional Japanese arts. One of the things he frequently talks about is the sword. And this is a Japanese katana, if I'm trying to pronounce it correctly. And the katana is a very, very, this is the result of perhaps thousands of years of experimentation in blacksmithing. The sword itself, right, has a few secrets to its success. One is that it only has one side is sharp. One side has a sharp edge, and the other is perhaps the more important. If you were to look at this sturdy weapon, right, you can see that, let's see if I can get this framed right, right? There's virtually no vibration. And part of that is because the sword is so thick. The sword is also incredibly hard, though. Now, if you wanted to create just a hard cutting surface, you could make a weapon out of glass, you could make a weapon out of, I don't know, perhaps diamonds, assuming you could find one that was in the right shape. You probably couldn't. But glass is sharp because it's hard. Glass is sharp because it's hard. And what that means is that it can do a great job of cutting. Anybody who's ever picked up a broken wine glass knows how well glass is at cutting. The problem is that if you were to have a blade, say the size, even, maybe 1/10 of this, it's brittle. And that's an important thing to know when we're talking about tools, is that hardness equals sharpness, but hardness also equals brittle. Now, if you were to compare that to, say, the English broadsword, which is much thinner, right? And look at if you can see that, it even makes a lovely sound. Also, the result of perhaps thousands of years of engineering. I have lots of swords because my mother, as a child, prevented me from owning any, so I bought several as I grew older and moved out on my own. The reason that the katana is so resilient to vibration, more than any other reason, is that it's actually a folded piece of metal, and inside the not sharp edge, there is a rod of soft iron that's welded into the weapon that allows it to absorb the shock of battle or of practice. And isn't that interesting? That the most sophisticated weapon is one with a deeply tough, sharp, strong, hard, but yet brittle outer shell with a soft inner core that allows it to adapt to the vibration, or to accept the violent vibration of doing battle or practice. So with that in mind, I wanted to present something of a challenge to us and see if we can access that soft inner core that is able to accept the blows, perhaps, of a differing opinion. And I'd like to try to create a SteelMan of our 7 principles read from the perspective of somebody who holds a conservative mindset. And I'll do my best, and you can tell me what you think. So here we go. Our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And this is actually, when I say it's perhaps one of the easiest, not because it's something that's obvious and everybody should know, but more that in the religious community, there seems to be an almost universal agreement on this principle. At least, when it comes to Western religion, modern Christianity, and Judaism has gone through some reconciliations where that principle has been applied to people outside of the Jewish community, that humanity is a fraternity and a sorority, that we are part of an extended family. That being said, I think I can do a conservative reading of this, and again, you can tell me what you think in the discussion. But if we have inherent worth and dignity, then from where is that derived? Right? It can't necessarily be emergent because it hasn't always been universal. If you look back through history, the history of humanity, especially the history of humanity before the axial age, but even after, you don't see the value of human life be extended to those outside of the family or outside of the tribe. In India, there's a saying that is, the tears of the stranger are but water, meaning that there is no common suffering outside of the immediate family, or perhaps the immediate network of people about whom you care. Sorry about that. Now, a conservative reading, especially a conservative religious reading, would state that we are endowed with inherent worth, and dignity by a loving creator who bestows that on us, that there is an ultimate judge that has decided that you are created in the image of God, right? Or for our purposes, perhaps the image of the Spirit of life. That there is something transcendent and divine about the human self that goes beyond the material. It is also, from a conservative standpoint, I think, the best argument for having a pro-life stance. Because if each individual is endowed with inherent worth and dignity, then the issue of human worth and dignity, even inside the womb, is something that we have to consider. Now, as the kids say, don't get it twisted. I am not making an argument for outlawing abortion. But what I will say is, have we thought this issue through to its full extent? That if we are willing to extend inherent worth and dignity to the criminal, to the murderer, to the rapist, to the child molester, then are we not hypocritical if we're not extending such values to the unborn? Food for thought. Second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships. And again, this is something in seeking the lofty goals of justice and equity, how do we set those goals? How is it that we can recognize what, as the Constitution writers termed, a more perfect union, right? Not a perfect union, but a more perfect union. That perfection is a goal that is on top of the mountain of near impossibility. And yet we can see that. We have a sense of what perfection ought to look like. And I would say that this desire for perfection is one of those things that's truly driving those in the social justice movement. They're saying that we are less perfect because of racial divisions and the difficulties of modern human life, especially for those who are poorer or worse off, who are, dare I say, of a lower caste or class. And yet, we have a vision of how we ought to treat those people, and that's where the compassion comes in. But again, it seems that we are reaching towards the divine. And how you define the divine is perhaps up to you, but especially from a Christian standpoint, we can say that God is the embodiment of perfection, of perfect love, of perfect knowledge, and perfect wisdom. And we can aspire to that. And that's what makes the Jesus story so valuable, is the idea that God comes down to earth in order to teach humanity the qualities of God, the loving qualities of God, and the righteous qualities of God. So our third principle, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregation. So again, this is something that stems out of the very liberal first principle. And by liberal, I mean classical liberalism. Classical liberalism sets at the height of value the individual and their property. Because, of course, property in its classic sense is necessary to survival. And so we're talking about property of sustenance, of food, property of wealth in order to acquire that food or water. Or that's what we're discussing here. And in order to accept one another, we have to, on some level, see one another as equals. And it goes, as worthy of dignity. And again, this is something that points to the divine. Stephen Landale did a really great service about the first and the seventh principle being the two pillars that hold up Unitarian Universalism, and that the remaining five principles are natural outgrowths of those two. And in preparing for this service, I've absolutely found that to be true as well. So fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Well, that's what we're doing right now, isn't it? Right? The idea that you can take your deeply held beliefs and challenge them with things that might not make you feel comfortable, but that by doing so, by, dare I say, cutting, being the sword and cutting through what is superfluous or what is untrue, what is archaic and perhaps doesn't work for us anymore, is hopefully what we do on every Sunday. Now, what I will say is that unfortunately, the vast majority of services that we've heard are very one-sided. We've become rather dogmatic as a people, as a religion, and that is what that's what I'm looking to challenge for a moment. Fifth, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregation and society at large. So democracy is a very interesting proposition, because we are taught that democracy is the highest form of social involvement and social order. But the question is, what kind of democracy? Right? You see, the devil's in the details. Do we want a pure democracy? Those who are calling for the elimination of the Electoral College seem to want to get closer to a pure democracy. But does that mean that, say, children should be allowed to vote? Pure democracy would be the democratic involvement of every individual human being within a society. Do we want people who are not here legally voting? Or I should say undocumented. Do we want the undocumented people here voting? Some people would say yes. Some people would say that, well, they are involved directly in our society, therefore they should have a say in how that society is run, regardless of their citizenship status. And that's an interesting point of view, and I think one that we could entertain in further discussion. But I don't believe that a pure democracy is necessarily a good idea, because I'll give you the most basic example of this, that 51% of the people could vote to make slaves out of the remaining 49% of people in a pure democracy. It's overly simplistic, yes, but that problem is there. I think a better reading of the fifth principle is one where everybody has a voice, that we consider the voices of every individual, whether or not they're necessarily voting to affect change. And again, that's an outgrowth of, well, it's both the seventh principle and the first principle, right? If every person is inherently worthy and created of dignity, then we have a responsibility to hear what they have to say. Sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Well, we can only do that by acknowledging the struggle of the individual, and those of us who are able to contribute to make life more equitable and easier would have a responsibility to do that, which is the seventh principle, the idea that we're part of a greater web of existence. But that notion is a notion of charity. And charity is something that must be done voluntarily if it is to have any meaning. Coercive charity, i.e., taxes, the welfare system, and social programs of the like, come at the expense, at the threat of violence, because the state has a monopoly on the use of violence. And so, for instance, if somebody doesn't agree with where their taxes are being spent, say, for instance, I doubt many of you supported the first Iraq war. If you did, I'd be curious to hear why. And yet our taxes were used to pay for such a war. Now, let's say we were conscientious objectors and refused to pay a portion of our taxes not to support that war. Well, what's the result of that? The IRS then does an investigation and finds that you have not paid. And you say, well, wait a minute, I didn't agree to this war. I'm not going to pay for this war. What is the end result of that? If you take it far enough and refusing to pay, refusing to engage, eventually it's likely you will go to jail. What if you refuse to go to jail? What if you tell the cops, no, I'm not going? Right? And this is what I mean by coercive involvement in a system, that all laws, this is vital to understand, especially when we're looking to change aspects of our society by implementing laws. All laws come with the threat of violence, right? Same thing with taxes. All taxes come with the threat of violence. It's very different than charity. Charity is by necessity voluntary and is of benefit to the person giving the charity because they are reinforcing something that they genuinely believe in addition to the recipient of the charity, who is then recognized as a person of inherent worth and dignity. The seventh principle, mentioned this a little bit already, is respect for the interdependent web of an existence of which we are a part. And this is what I loved about Stephen Landale is because it really is like a set of polar opposites, that on one hand, we have the value of the individual, that old classical liberal value of the individual and their ability to live their life as free as possible. And on the other hand, there is a sense that we are part of a community and the individual has a responsibility to the community. We are a social species, and to ignore that fact is something that we do at our detriment. But I think a conservative reading would say that the seventh principle can never come at the expense of the first principle, right? That the individual ought never to be asked to work against their conscience or what they believe in their heart to be true, that we should never ask somebody to sacrifice what it is that makes them that person of inherent worth and dignity. And part of that inherent worth is the idea that everybody with a viewpoint has something to consider, has something to contribute, right, that we should consider. There is, of course, much more that could be said on all of this, but I will leave you with this idea, is that as we move towards our more perfect union as a church and as a society, that we have all of the tools, be they wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, saws, all of the tools that are necessary in our toolkit in order to make life better. And some of those are viewpoints that we might not necessarily agree, but can we find value in viewpoints that we don't agree with? Can we see that there are times where drastic measures might be necessary, even though we disagree with those drastic measures? That's the argument that many of the rioters are making in the cities across America now who are experiencing so much unrest. And again, don't mistake me for being in support of this. But what I am saying is that a people who are not heard, if your words aren't heard, then the frustration will lead to actions that will be seen. And that's a very dangerous place to be. Therefore, let us be more like the katana, right? That we will be resolute and hard in our principles, but soft and welcoming to those things that challenge us. And perhaps through that discussion and through that seeking, that vigilant, that stoic seeking of truth, that we will become a better people. Thank you very much. I hope you all have a beautiful Sunday. I would love to discuss this more on Zoom. Take care.
Our closing words today are by Martin Luther King Jr. An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity.